Hello, my name is Anne Potter and I came to Australia with my parents as a £10 POM in 1950, and I was nearly 5 years of age. My father was in the Second World War, and after the war finished he didn't think there was much scope in Scotland for anything and they wanted to make a new life. And he saw an advertisement in the local paper saying the Victorian Railways needed people to come to Australia to help plan the country, I suppose, and tradesmen, and it was £10. And because he was working in the railways, the ship that we came on carried our accommodation in the hull. So each person that came was supplied with a house, and they built it once we arrived in Australia. I remember being on the boat. I do remember when we were leaving you had streamers and people would throw the streamers from the deck to the boat, and once the boat sailed you were still hanging onto the streamers. But I think it was frightening for my parents because it was hot, it was in December, and they'd never been anywhere where the weather was sunny. They were always in a cold, snowy climate. And it was a bit of a moving around because we lived in a temporary accommodation, a hostel in Altona, till the house was built in Newport. And I just feel like I was born here because I was only young when I came. I do remember a little bit about Scotland, about the snow, and I visited there once when I was in my 30s, I suppose, and I did remember my grandmother's house, so I kept remembering little things. That's about all though. Well, it was difficult for my parents because, as I say, they'd never left home. They didn't have any backup, any relations. My father had never driven a car, so he had to ride his bike everywhere. My mother came from a huge family. There was 11 brothers and sisters, and it was a long way away. They didn't have a phone in those days. It took weeks to get a letter, so you just couldn't ring up Scotland and say hi like you can now. You had to book calls, and it was mainly by letters. You just wrote letters, sent photos. Everyone on the ship was in the same position, so I think it was probably just getting used to a different way of life in Australia, the weather. Everything was just different, and a lot of people didn't stay. They only stayed for the 2 years and went back to the United Kingdom. My father never got to go back ever because he passed away. But it was a very different life for them, I think, and I think the worst thing was they did miss their families. Yes, I've got some photos of myself on the boat, and I do remember the boat. I went to the Immigration Museum a few years ago and they had a mock-up of the cabins of the ships of that area, and I just remember it smelled the same. And it looked the same because I remember women and children were on one end of the boat and the men were on the other end of the boat. And it took 6 weeks to get here, so my mother always said she'd never get on a boat again in her life, and I don't think she ever did. It was too long a journey. Yeah. That was a fancy dress parade, I remember that. Everyone had to get dressed up. Yes, look, that's when I landed on the ship. That was on the page of the Sun Herald. You can see the cabin. See on the picture you see the cabin though. Yeah. This was a telegram, which probably, nobody does a telegram anymore, but this was in 1950, and it was just some of my mother's relations saying safe journey and good luck. It was delivered to the house in this little envelope that you got, and that was the quickest communication in those days. I think Australian, well, my aunt who still lives in Scotland and who is in her late 90s now, has the impression that Australian people are fairly outgoing and you don't speak to people in the street over there. I think it's very different. It's freer here, I think, and my grandmother came here once years and years ago, and she did not like it one bit because she thought people were too friendly. They used to walk in and say, "Hello, can I come in?" Well, that doesn't happen in Scotland. And it's very different, I think. Well, I think I've seen a lot of changes in Australia. It's different. The biggest one would be technology, of course, because I never thought that I'd ever be able to switch on a phone and see somebody thousands of miles away. But, well, I'm used to it now. I consider myself Australian because I've lived here 75 years. Well, I would like all my grandchildren to travel and see the world and perhaps go back to Scotland and see where I came from and keep their heritage. Always go back there. I wanted to be a journalist and my father didn't allow me to do that. In those days you did what your parents told you to do. So I did a secretarial course. Girls in those days were nurses, teachers, or maybe office work. And I always did office work. I worked for some big companies. I did work for the Department of Defence, and I went to, when we lived in Sale, I worked for Exxon, which was starting to build the oil rigs then, and that was interesting. It was all American staff and they were just digging for oil. That was a really good job. And I've worked at the Arts Centre for a few years. I loved that because I would like to be on the stage, but that'll never happen. So I enjoyed working there, seeing all the shows and seeing these people that were entertainers. Loved that. I go to ukulele, belong to a ukulele band, and I go to a couple of craft groups a week. I love to read. I play mahjong twice a week, which I love. Jigsaw puzzles, as much as I can fit in a week. No, not really. Just be happy, do what you can do and make a career of something that you like or you'd love to do. Follow your dream.